Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us from different places where you are. My name is Carmen Labarte, psychoanalyst in Lima, member of the British Psychoanalytic Society and the Peruvian Psychoanalytic Association. This webinar is an activity of the IPA Communications Committee under the coordination of Mariano Rupertas and the direction of Sylvia Weinwood. This webinar is being recorded so those registered who cannot attend online can watch the video later. And then the video will be accessible on YouTube to the public. The speaker's opinion are personal and are not institutional positions. The webinar titled Unlocking Freud, a conversation with Dr. Mark Solms on the Revised Standard Edition is an invitation tied to his extraordinary achievement and contribution to psychoanalysis. We thank him wholeheartedly for joining this conversation. Dr. Solms will take us along the 30 years that finally led to the Revised Standard Edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud by way of revising, supplementing, and editing James Strachey's original translation. He will explain why this is a revised edition and not a new translation. The Revised Standard Edition, published jointly by the British Institute of Psychoanalysis and publishers Rowman and Littlefield, is one of the most important scholarly works in the last 30 years, and not only in the field of psychoanalysis. The new papers by Freud that Mark Solms has added, both translated and edited by him, make it possible to understand much better than before the continuity between Freud's work as a neuroscientist and as the discoverer of psychoanalysis. Mark Solms' vast commentary and his attempt to correct the mistakes and misinterpretation in Strachey's translation, together with the flexibility provided by his new glossary of technical terms, make the Revised Standard Edition the new tool for understanding Freud in the 21st century. Before handing over the presentation to Dr. Solms, I will explain briefly how this webinar will function. It has two sections. In the first section, Mark Solms will give a 45-minute presentation. The second section is a question and answer portion devoted to freely exchanging selected questions and ideas with the speaker and attendees. I will start by making some questions, and participants are invited to send in theirs. You will find questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. If you want to ask a question, please write it in this box. You can post your questions throughout the whole course of the webinar, from the very beginning. Please remember that questions will not be answered until Dr. Solms completes his presentation. Now we are ready to begin. Let me point some milestones in our guest's distinguished career. I will not read Mark's complete CV, which has been widely circulated and can be revisited on the IPA website. Professor Mark Solms is a member of the British Psychoanalytical Society and the American and South African Psychoanalytical Association. He is the director of neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town. He is an honorary fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists. He has received numerous honors and awards, including the Sigourney Award, which honors outstanding psychoanalytic work worldwide. He has published 350 scientific papers and 8 books, the latest entitled The Hidden Self. He is also, and this brings us back to the title of the webinar, the authorized editor and translator of the Revised Standard Edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, 24 volumes, and the Complete Neuroscientific Works of Sigmund Freud, 4 volumes. Let us all welcome Dr. Mark Solms.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you all for being here. So I'm now going to share my screen and begin. How funny. That's the wrong title. So rather look at this. Here is the cover of the Revised Standard Edition of the 14th volume, the one that contains the metapsychological papers. I'm going to divide my talk into a few sections of very unequal length. I'll begin with some preliminaries. Here is a drawing that Freud made in 1878. And in this drawing, he was trying to isolate the nerve root of a very lowly fish and trying to trace its origins and its termination. And among the neurons that you can see on the screen, among the nerves that he identified in this nerve root, he observed that some of them do not actually belong to the root. They just lean on the root. They just follow the same pathway, even though they're not actually part of the root coming out of the spinal cord. He named these fibers angelernte Fasern, which literally means leaning on fibers, but which in my translation of the neuroscientific works are called anaclitic fibers. The reason I did that is because Freud uses exactly the same word in his psychoanalytic writings. He speaks about an angelernte typus of relationship, a leaning on type of relationship, which Strachey translated as an anaclitic type of relationship. Keep all of that in mind. I'll refer to it again later. Now we talk about Strachey's translations themselves. When I was appointed to this task, which was, as Carmen said, actually she said 30 years ago, it was 29 years ago, the main question that I faced was, do I have to start from scratch? Do I need to replace Strachey's translation with a completely different one? And again, as Carmen told you, I didn't do that. I didn't replace Strachey's translations, rather I revised them. This is the single biggest decision that I made as editor of this Revised Standard Edition. So I'm going to spend most of my time justifying, explaining to you why I took that decision. If you look at the editor's introduction to the original Standard Edition, in Volume 1, which was published in 1966, Strachey says there that he is imagining the person whose writings he's translating. He's imagining the writings to be those of some English man of science, of wide education, born in the middle of the 19th century. Now, Freud, of course, was not an Englishman of science. Freud was a Viennese, Austrian, German-speaking man of science. And so here is the difficulty with translation. You have to reimagine, you have to transform the writings of somebody from one language into another language. And in doing this, Strachey has to reinvent Freud as an Englishman, because now Freud speaks English in the Standard Edition. There are two different ways in which this process of transforming one language into another, the essence of translation, there are two traditions as to how this is done. One of them is literal translation. In other words, you try as close as possible, word for word, to change the German language into English language, trying to literally transpose what Freud said in German into something said in English. The advantage of that is that you are not distorting what Freud said. You're just transforming it into English. The downside of it is that it ends up being bad English because, of course, if you literally directly translate from German into English, then you're using the conventions of German rather than the conventions of English. No two languages map onto each other directly. Therefore, there's another tradition which uses a more loose, figurative form of translation, where you don't try to reproduce faithfully, word for word, what Freud said in German into an English equivalent, but rather you try to catch the idea that is expressed in that sentence, expressed in good German. You try to transpose the idea into good English. So it's not word for word, rather it's trying to capture the essence of what the person is trying to say and transforming it into another language. Now, when Strachey said that he pictured himself producing the writings of some English man of science, he adopted the second position. He's imagining Freud as an Englishman, and Freud is expressing these same ideas, but expressing them in English. There's no blame to be attached to Strachey for doing that, because as I've said, there are two different ways of translating, and something is lost either way, because no two languages map onto each other exactly. I will just point out, in terms of defending Strachey's taking this approach, that when Freud translated, and Freud did quite a bit of translating, he translated from English into German, he translated from French into German, and occasionally he even translated from Italian and from Spanish into German. And whenever he did that, he took this approach. He was not a literal translator. He translated more loosely in the same way that Strachey did. I must mention also that Freud was very proud to have somebody from the Strachey family translating him, somebody from such an eminent literary family. And he was very pleased to have his words cast into a very high quality English. And he directly supervised Strachey's translations. And he was very, very impressed, even replacing the great Joan Riviere, who had translated him immediately before Strachey. He supported very strongly and personally Strachey's way of translating him. Now, the controversy about Strachey's translations does not really pivot on this, because, as I say, these are just two different traditions, and nobody can be blamed for following the one or the other tradition, because I'll repeat one more time, something is lost either way. This is the part of what Strachey imagined Freud as that has attracted the major criticism. Strachey says he's imagining Freud as an English man of science, and many people have questioned whether this is a correct characterization of Freud. To them, Freud was not a man of science, he was a man of letters. He was somebody who represents the humanities more than the natural sciences. When I say that this is the criticism that has confronted Strachey's translations, it really was from the very beginning. In the 1960s already, Bruhl and Brandt, for example, were arguing this. Subsequently, many others, for example, Jean Laplanche, Darius Ornstein, Adam Phillips, and perhaps most infamously, Bruno Bettelheim, who attacked Strachey's translations from a dizzy height. I think it's a little curious, this idea that Freud was not a man of science, because that's certainly how Freud saw himself. But according to Laplanche, this is a false scientization of Freud. The way that Strachey represented Freud as a man of science was to falsely scientize him. This phrase that I've got on the screen easily sums up the entire criticism of Strachey's translations. I went very deeply into the literature, the secondary literature about Strachey's translations, and I assure you this is the essence of the criticism. I say that it's odd because this is what Freud wrote in one of his very last publications. He said, psychoanalysis too is a natural science. What else can it be? How can you, I ask you, how can you falsely scientize somebody who himself says that he's doing natural science? But let's go a little bit more deeply into this question. It pivots on the technical terminology. You remember that I mentioned the word anaclysis earlier. It pivots on Strachey's use of words like this. Words which are neologisms derived from ancient Greek and Latin. This is scientistic, according to people like Laplanche, falsely scientizing Freud, who didn't write like that. Here are some well-known examples. I could easily multiply this list. I'm just putting these ones on the screen in order to illustrate the nature of the point. The German word Anlehnung, which I've already mentioned, which, as I said, Strachey has translated as anaclysis from the ancient Greek. In German, the word Anlehnung simply means leaning on, as is written here. It's not a neologism derived from any ancient dead language. Any German speaker will immediately understand the word Anlehnung means something is leaning on something else. Likewise with Besetzung. Any German speaker will know that Besetzung means occupation. If one country invades another country, they besetz its territory, they occupy it. It's very clear to a German speaker what that means. In fact, if you sit in the lavatory, a public lavatory, you slide that little latch, and then it says besetzt. This lavatory is occupied. So it's as literally a transparent a word as that. No German speaker can have any doubt what it means. But Strachey translated it as cathexis, again from very ancient Greek. No English speaker knows what cathexis means. It's a neologism invented by Strachey, and this is the criticism. Why on earth did he do this? The same applies to another word, Einfühlung, which literally means feeling into. So again, any German speaker knows Einfühlung means feeling your way into something. And yet Strachey used this word, which now we are all familiar with, empathy, but it was not a familiar word those days. It's another word that's made up from ancient roots. What could be more straightforward than the word ich? It just means I. There's no word that has a more immediately transparent meaning than ich. It's me. And yet Strachey translated it as ego from Latin. The corollary word es, das es, which means the it. Any German speaker again knows what that means. And by the way, when you refer to a child in German, you say es, it, when you speak of a child. So it has also some relevance to the concept that Freud is using here. Also the relevance that it's not me. Ich is me. Es is something foreign to me, something I don't know. I'm not familiar with it. And yet Strachey translates it as id, again from the Latin. And my last example, Schaulust, it means desire to look or pleasure in looking. In German, Lust means both desire and pleasure. But Strachey translates it as scopophilia. It sounds like a terrible disease, scopophilia. Now, why on earth did Strachey do this? I say to you again, remember, this is the nub, the essence of the criticism of Strachey. He falsely scientized Freud, and especially with respect to technical terminology. The ordinary, everyday, descriptive, vernacular terms that Freud used in the German, Strachey replaced them with erudite, abstruse words derived from ancient Greek and Latin. And this, I say again, the claim is this falsely scientizes Freud. It distorts somebody who's speaking ordinary German into somebody who's speaking scientific English with all of these Latinisms and neologisms from ancient Greek. So why did Strachey do that? Now, let me take you to the discipline that Freud began with. Freud was a neuroscientist. Freud was a neuroanatomist. Let me just get let me just get a nice pointer. Yeah. So in German neuroanatomy, there's a thing called das Balken, which means the beam. Any student of anatomy, when they learn about this Balken, will know there's this beam of fibers. It looks like a beam of fibers that join the two hemispheres to each other. But in English, we don't call it the beam, we call it the corpus callosum. If you look at that beam, you'll see in the front of it, there's a bend, which looks a little bit like a knee. In German, therefore, it's called das Knie des Balkens, the knee of the beam. But in English neuroanatomy, we don't have a concept called the knee of the beam. We have a concept called the genu of the corpus callosum. There's another part of the brain called das Brücke, the bridge. Again, any German student of anatomy will know this is a bridge. Here it is. It's in English called the pons. Why don't we call it the bridge? In German, here's another term. It means literally 4 hills. Here it is in the brain. Well, it's cut in half here, so you're only seeing 2 of them. But there are these 4 little hills at the back of the brainstem. In English, we call them the corpora quadrigemina, if we're speaking about a human. If we're speaking about a non-human animal, we call it the tectum. All these terms derive from ancient Greek and Latin. Here's my favorite. In German, there's a thing called das Kleinhirn. It means the little brain. Here it is, the little brain that hangs off the back of the brainstem, as opposed to the big brain up here. In German, this is called the big brain, the Grosshirn. And this is called the little brain, the Kleinhirn. And yet, in English neuroanatomy, we speak of the cerebellum for the little brain and the cerebrum for the big brain. What I'm illustrating for you is that this is conventional in English scientific writing. If you are a scientist, as Freud said he was, then in German, you write like this. And in English, you write like that. And remember, Strachey is imagining Freud as an Englishman. An Englishman of science doesn't use words like this. He uses words like that. Now, you might say, oh, we know Mark Solms, he's a neuroscientist, he's biased. So let me refer you to another discipline, chemistry. In German chemistry, there's a substance called Wasserstoff, which means nothing other than water stuff. In English chemistry, we call it hydrogen. In German chemistry, there's another substance called Sauerstoff, which means nothing other than sour stuff. But in English chemistry, we call it oxygen. So what I'm saying to you is that as a translator of a German scientist, which Freud self-consciously considered himself to be, if you're translating from German science into English science, it would be as absurd as to, if Freud was a chemist and he spoke of Sauerstoff, then according to Laplanche and Ornstein and Phillips and Bettelheim and so on, I should translate it not as oxygen, I should call it sour stuff, and the same with hydrogen and so on. Here's what Jones said, and this is absolutely the case. Jones puts it in his own pompous way. He says, Germany, of all the civilized countries, is the only one that eschews the international vocabulary, a fact that has called for much spleen among foreign readers of that language. What Jones is referring to is that the use of ancient Greek and Latin terms in science was an attempt to have a lingua franca, an international language, a language which will span the whole globe, and all scientists will know that this term, in whichever language they're reading it, refers to the same thing. But in Germany and Austria, they didn't do that. Why they didn't do that? Well, in the case of Germany, which Jones is isolating here, I can only suspect it has something to do with Lutheranism, with Luther's wanting to move away from the Latin Catholic Church and come closer to the German people. I don't know why it is the case, but it is the case. It is conventional in German science to speak about things like water stuff and sour stuff, but it is silly in English science. You look ridiculous if you speak like that. And so, dear colleagues, this is the basis upon which I made the decision not to replace Strachey's technical vocabulary, because Strachey was imagining Freud as an English man of science, not as a German man of science. And I say again, it would make Freud look ridiculous if he were to do otherwise. So now we come back to the term that I introduced you to at the very beginning, anaclysis. Laplanche said that Strachey's use of this was a barbaric and lifeless term. These are not mild words, a false scientization of Freud, a barbaric and lifeless term. These are the accusations that are leveled at Strachey. But remember what I told you earlier, that when Freud, as an anatomist, discovered these fibers that lean upon the nerve root but are not in fact part of the nerve root, he called them angelernte Fasern, and it's perfectly normal in writing, translating this term that Freud invented this term to describe these fibers. And in German science, you do that. You use a word, an everyday descriptive term. It's entirely conventional, entirely appropriate within the conventions of English scientific writing that you use a term like anaclitic fibers. If I had translated that as leaning on fibers, it would just look like bad English and awkward English and a very odd way of translating an anatomical concept. And so you extend from there to the psychoanalytic use of the very same term. Freud later coined the term an angelernte typus of relationship, and it would be equally silly to call it a leaning on type of relationship. So Strachey calls it an anaclitic type of relationship. And if I had used anaclitic in Freud's neuroscientific writings, but leaning on in Freud's psychological writings, the continuity between these concepts in these two phases of Freud's scientific life would be lost. And I say again, Freud would be divorced from the conventions of all English scientific writing. So it's on this basis that I made the decision not to replace Strachey's vocabulary, but to revise it. And I'll show you in a moment how I revised it. But the same applies not only to his technical vocabulary, I've also revised the whole of his translations rather than starting afresh. I took the English, and that's Strachey, and compared it to the German sentence by sentence. That's why it took me 29 years. And in each case, I thought, has Strachey committed an error here? Only if Strachey made an error did I change it. If what he was doing was within the conventions of good English and good English scientific writing, then I stuck with what Strachey did. What do I mean by an error? So I mean some pretty banal things, like, for example, Strachey had very poor vision by the time he did the standard edition. So he misread many things. In fact, he often overlooked a clause, sometimes a whole sentence. So that's an error. There I've corrected it. But also sometimes in relation to technical terms, he made errors. And I have to say, ironically, the reason he made this error that I'm going to show you now is because Strachey was not a scientist. It's not Strachey who falsely scientized Freud. Strachey was a literary character, a literary fellow. And so he didn't realize that when Freud used the word Trieb and when he used the word instinct, he was talking about two different things. Any biologist will know that a Trieb is a drive and an instinct is an instinct. But Strachey translated them both with the word instinct. A drive is a force. It's a demand on the mind to perform work. And that work can take many different forms. That's why Freud speaks about the Schicksale of the Trieb, the vicissitudes of the drive. An instinct has no vicissitudes at all. An instinct is a fixed, immutable action program which is stereotypically repeated over and over again. So in biology, in fact, an instinct is one of the possible responses to a drive. One of the ways in which a drive can be satisfied is by instinct, but it can also be satisfied in a great many other ways, and you can see the enormous importance of that for psychoanalysis, for our whole understanding of, for example, displacement and substitute formation in general. So here's an example of an error. That is the major technical term that I've changed. In my revised standard edition, where Freud says Trieb, I've put drive. Where Freud says instinct, I've put instinct. Other technical terms are more ambiguous, and I'm just giving you the best known example because Bruno Bettelheim made this the centerpiece of his attack on Strachey. His book was entitled Freud and Man's Soul, and in German, Seele is the word that we use for soul. And that's what Bettelheim's talking about when he says Freud and man's soul. He means Strachey distorted. When Freud spoke about the Seele, which is a soul, Strachey called it the mind. And this is the centerpiece, as I say, of Bettelheim's critique. Now, I'm saying this is, I've said this is an ambiguous term, and I'm using this to illustrate the point. I said to you, no language maps one-to-one onto any other language. So in German, there's this one word, Seele, and in English, you can translate it either as soul or as mind. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me, at least those of you who are English speakers, that a soul is a very different thing than a mind. So when Freud's intended meaning, remember what I said about capturing the idea, when the idea is what we in English call the mind, then I translated it as mind. Where the idea that Freud is conveying is what we in English would speak of as the immortal soul, then I translated it as soul. And there's another German term, by the way, Geist, which is relatively easily translated as spirit. Here's another example, Nachträglichkeit. This has been a very controversial translation. It literally means afterwardness, and Strachey is attacked for having translated it as deferred action. Why didn't he just translate it as afterwardness? Well, first of all, because there's no such word as afterwardness. It's again awkward, bad English. You can't. There isn't such an abstract noun as afterwardness. But also because, in fact, when Freud uses the word Nachträglichkeit and its various cognates, he uses it in different contexts and in different ways. And so when I compared Strachey with Freud, I saw that, in fact, it's not true that Strachey uniformly translated Nachträglichkeit as deferred action. He used many different words, and I'll give you some examples. Here he says, sexual life includes the function of obtaining pleasure from zones of the body, a function which is subsequently brought into the service of reproduction. And there, the word that Freud used was nachträglich. Strachey says subsequently. Here, Freud says, in other attacks, the pathogenic material consisted of a piece of the patient's childhood history, which had not come to light while I was analyzing him, and which now belatedly came away. Nachträglich, the same word, remember I'm saying Nachträglichkeit and its cognates. You don't know when you're reading Strachey that this is referring to Freud's concept of Nachträglichkeit. And here, this other English word refers to the same concept. And so what I've done, as you can see illustrated on the screen, in each case, what I've done is I've put the German word in square brackets so that the English-speaking reader knows that this is a red thread running through Freud's writings, that there's this concept and you can identify that concept in this way. That's the device that I've used. What I've also done is, in the case of every technical term, in its first appearance in every paper of Freud's in the Revised Standard Edition, the first time that word appears in each paper, I've put the German equivalent in square brackets, and then put a capital T, a superscript capital T next to it. What that tells the reader is that the translation of this word is discussed in volume 24. So rather than replacing Strachey's technical terminology with a new terminology, recognizing that something is always lost in translation, I've put the German word there and discussed it at length in volume 24. There in volume 24, what I've done is first of all said, this is Freud's term, this is what it literally means, this is how Strachey translated it, this is how he justifies that translation, this is all the criticisms that have been leveled against this translation, and by the way, this is how others have translated that term. Remember, Strachey is not the only person who's translated Freud, and I have to say also that many of these terms do not belong only to psychoanalysis. So it's a question of how are they conventionally translated in other disciplines. And I'll give you a telling example. Das Ich is not an invention of Freud's. It's a term that's been used in German philosophy for centuries before Freud. And when those German idealist philosophers were translated into English, guess what the conventional translation was for Das Ich? It was the ego. So Strachey was following established philosophical convention. He would have broken the continuities not only between Freud's psychological and his neuroscientific writing, but also the continuities between Freud's writing in psychoanalysis and established conventions in other disciplines like philosophy. A further point I want to make about this device that I've used of putting the technical term in square brackets and putting a superscript T there is that sometimes it's a cognate version. So you might not know what is the technical term here. It's abführen is the term that we're speaking about. So it just shows you this is the word you must look for in the glossary. Here, likewise, Nervenerregung, the technical term that's discussed is Erregung, and so that's in the margin, so you know that's the word I must look up in volume 24. If I'm interested in all of these controversies, that's where I'll be educated about them. Here is the opening page of those discussions of the different terms. Abführen has not attracted so much controversy. Abwehr has attracted a lot of controversy, so that's a much longer entry. Motiv, not that controversial, but Nachträglichkeit, very controversial. So I have a long essay in which I discuss the thing in all the different ways that I told you. There are other controversies about Strachey's translation. It's not only the technical terms. Sometimes it's the title of a particular work or the way in which a particular turn of phrase is translated. So in those cases, what I do is I put a small t, which tells the reader this, what you've just read, the translation of this is controversial, and you can go to volume 24, and there you will find a discussion of the controversy. So, for example, in a certain place, Freud wrote Mädchenfreien Standes, and Strachey translated it as respectable girls. But Wilson points out that it doesn't refer, it could be translated as unattached girls, which means girls who are available for sexual relations. And Eisler and Schröter agreed with Wilson on this point, so I changed it. And here I make the reader aware there's a controversy here, so you can decide for yourself about the strength or weakness of the various arguments. Okay, so I've covered the main thing I wanted to do with you, which is to tell you why I've revised Strachey's translation rather than replaced it. But the Revised Standard Edition doesn't only consist in me revising Strachey's translations. There's also new translations, which I myself did from scratch, of new Freud material, because there's actually quite a lot of material. In fact, if you include the big and the small, it's 50-something, I think it's 56 or 59 new titles in the Revised Standard Edition that were not in the old Standard Edition. I don't have time to tell you about all of them. I'm just going to skim through them. This is a list of the new Freud material in the Revised Standard Edition. There's some lectures on interesting topics like hypnosis and suggestion and obsessional ideas and phobias, which Strachey didn't realize the lecture was published by Freud. There's a case study from the time of the studies in hysteria that is an interesting new case study. There is a report by Freud on the characteristics of his own typical dreams. There's a statement on marriage law reform. Freud was consulted by the Austrian government who were thinking of reforming marriage law, and Freud had very progressive views on this matter. So you must remember this was Catholic Austria, in which there were very severe restrictions placed on them, and not only Catholic. I'm speaking about 19th century Austria, early 20th century Austria, and so here you see Freud the feminist. A similar here, a statement on homosexuality that was overlooked by Strachey. Freud was asked to comment on a patient, or a man, in fact, not a patient, a public figure, who was found guilty of moral insanity because he had sexual relations with a young boy. And the moral insanity refers to the crime of homosexuality. And Freud was asked to comment on this. And Freud said, homosexuality is not a crime. It's not even an illness. But what this man did was have sexual relations with an underage boy. And he said, that's a crime. It should be a crime. And it doesn't matter whether it's a boy or a girl. It's the same crime. Here I translated also two Rundbriefe. Rundbriefe are circular letters that went, the Freud's committee, they would each of them write a letter, which others, the next person, they would send it to the next person on the committee, who would then add their comment and then send it to the next person. It was like a sort of a precursor of email, and these were these Rundbriefe. And Jones wrote a Rundbrief. He said, Jones was president of the IPA, and he had been consulted by the Dutch Psychoanalytic Society. They said, they have a psychiatrist who wants to train. He's homosexual. Can they accept him? And Jones said to the committee, don't you think I should send out a general notice to the IPA component societies that we don't train homosexuals? And Freud then saw the circular letter and he said, what on earth are you talking about? What do you mean we don't train homosexuals? Since when is that the case? And that each candidate must be assessed on their own merits. It doesn't matter whether they're heterosexual or homosexual, and how you become homosexual is no more or less pathological than how you become heterosexual. That's what we want to understand. And Jones wrote back and said, well, of course, we think that, but Professor, we must think about the public. To the public, homosexuality is abhorrent. And Freud lambasted him again and basically said, I suppose I would not swear on a thing like this, but something like FUC star the public opinion. So I'm sorry, I'm going too slowly. So that's an interesting new material. He wrote a little synopsis of his book on jokes, which is very interesting. Here is a slightly tongue-in-cheek attack on the Catholic notion that every sperm is sacred, Freud campaigning for contraception. So I'm showing this side of Freud, which is slightly overlooked in the old translation. Freud the feminist, Freud the gay rights psychoanalyst, Freud the activist for contraception. This is a major metapsychological paper, one of the supposedly lost metapsychological papers. What else shall I draw to your attention? A draft synopsis of the ego and the id. That's very interesting. This is extremely interesting. In Jones's biography, Freud wrote the book on lay analysis, saying that you don't need to be a doctor to be an analyst, and the American Psychoanalytic Association disagreed. So when a new edition of the lay analysis book came out, Freud put a postscript in which he criticized the position of the American Psychoanalytic Association. And Jones says in his biography that he advised Freud to drop 3 sentences, which he thought were impolitic. That was the word that he used. So I thought, well, let's have a look at these 3 sentences. They turn out, if I remember correctly, to be 3 paragraphs or perhaps 6 paragraphs. It's certainly not 3 sentences. It's several paragraphs where Freud lambastes everything American. It's really actually comical. It's sort of embarrassing, but it's also really interesting. Here's a letter in which he endorses Spinoza's philosophy. Here's another very interesting thing. This book on Woodrow Wilson that was published by Bullitt, and Bullitt claimed in 1967 that Freud had co-authored it, and the psychoanalytic establishment said, no way, this is not Freud. Anna Freud said it's not Freud. Erik Erikson said it's not Freud. They all disowned this book. And so Strachey didn't include it in the standard edition. But when you go to the original notes, which are now can be found in the Yale, when I say the notes, I mean Bullitt's papers were deposited in the Yale University Library by his daughter upon his death. And if you actually go and look there, you find handwritten manuscripts by Freud, Freud's contributions to this book. Now, what's very interesting is if you compare Freud's contributions that he actually wrote to the published version, you see that Bullitt greatly distorted what Freud wrote. So what I've included in the Revised Standard Edition is Freud's own words, what he wrote about Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was a fundamentalist Christian, and it includes this what Freud wrote, Freud's most comprehensive psychoanalysis of Christianity that I've seen, and also a beautiful introduction to psychoanalytic theory as a whole. Here's another thing on homosexuality. Freud, a woman in America consulted Freud, asked Freud basically if he could cure her son, conversion therapy. And Freud wrote back to her and said, you don't cure homosexuality. It's not a disorder. And if you were to send your son to me, I would help him to adjust to being homosexual in a homophobic society, which is rather difficult. Here's a beautiful letter to Einstein, and I think that's enough of that. I mustn't go on for too long. I just want to show you something about the revision of the standard edition is not only a revision of the translation, it's also a revision of the editorial apparatus. You must remember that the standard edition was published in the 50s and the 60s. So there's been 60 years of Freud scholarship, if not 70 years of Freud scholarship. So it's very out of date. So I've updated the whole editorial apparatus to bring it into line with contemporary scholarship. Then here I'm just showing you in the margins, I've cross-referenced. So the pagination of the old standard edition is given in the margins. So if you're wanting to, if you read in the secondary literature, because of course everything up until now in our literature cites the old standard edition. So if you now have the new standard edition, how are you going to find that reference? Well, you find it very easily by using the marginal pagination. Here I'm illustrating for you another thing about the editorial apparatus, which is that I've underlined everything that's new. The publishers were anxious that the reader must be able to distinguish between what Strachey said and what I said in the editorial apparatus. And so I've used this faint underlining to indicate everything that's new, everything that's me speaking, as opposed to Strachey speaking. And I hope that once we go through 2 or 3 printings, and everybody starts to accept the Revised Standard Edition as the canonical one, that the publishers will be able to drop this underlining, which I find distracting, and retain it only in the electronic edition, where you can switch it off. Another point is that I've included cross-references to Freud's neuroscientific works. Even though those 4 volumes are not yet out, I'm far enough along with them to be able to make cross-references to them. So enough about the editorial apparatus in general. There's one aspect of the editorial apparatus that I think is really striking, which I want to draw your attention to, and that is the Freud bibliography. The Freud bibliography in the standard edition, where all of Freud's works are listed, every work that he ever published, and they're enumerated: 1900A, 1900B, 1901A, 1901B, C, D, and so on. These are the official identifying numerals for each of Freud's works. Now, in that Freud bibliography, it was prepared in the case of that volume after Strachey's death in 1974. In that bibliography, the official listing of Freud's works, it listed 368 entries, of which 310 were published during Freud's lifetime. In the Revised Standard Edition, it lists 1,736 entries. That shows you how badly out of date was the Freud bibliography. And of these 1,736, 687 were published during Freud's lifetime, compared to the 310 in the original. How can that be? It's because Strachey overlooked the vast bulk of Freud's neuroscientific writings. Again, the man who's supposed to have falsely scientized Freud was in fact not very familiar with the scientific Freud. But what about this difference? How does that happen? Well, of course, since Freud's death, a great many of his writings have been translated. Outstanding among these, of course, are his correspondences. But just about anything that Freud ever wrote is now published. And so if we want in the official Freud bibliography in the standard edition to be able to tell readers what everything is that Freud's published in the English language, then you have to make this major update. I will end just with some tiny other things before I go. Well, I'm not going, before I stop this presentation. There's the question of offensive terminology. Freud used offensive terms. Freud spoke of certain things as perverse practices, which nowadays nobody would think of as perverse. Freud speaks of inverts, which is an offensive term. Freud speaks of primitive peoples and of savages, and whatnot. What is the translator to do with all of this? There is, of course, the temptation to sanitize it, but actually the truth is Freud used offensive terms. Freud was a man of his times. He was very progressive and enlightened for his times, but he was a man of his times. So I'm afraid all I could do was translate faithfully the offensive terms that Freud used, and in the editorial introduction, make an apology to the reader for the offense that is caused. A particularly difficult issue was, I've told you that Freud scholarship has moved on a great deal since the 50s and the 60s. And one of the intriguing ways in which it's moved on is all of Freud's case studies, in which he disguised, of course, and he camouflaged, changed biographic and demographic and other details. All of these patients have been identified, and we now know the real facts. How long Freud actually saw them, as opposed to how long he says he saw them. Which years Freud saw them in, rather than the one he says he saw them in. Whether they slept with their cousin or their uncle or their brother, Freud would change it. I mean, these things matter to us. How many siblings they had, where they were in the sibling order, and all of that. So all of this I've been able to incorporate into the updated scholarly apparatus. But the question was, should I also include their names? In the secondary literature, these historians who've researched these people have identified them by name. So we now know who the Rat Man was, who Little Hans was, who Anna O was, and so on. I decided, and some of you may think I'm priggish, I decided it's not right. I have, even though those names are in the secondary literature, I've included all the demographic information, but I have not included the names. And for me, the principle was, if I try to imagine myself, when I go to my analyst, when I decide, shall I enter analysis, if I have to ask myself the question, if my analyst becomes sufficiently famous one day, then will my name become public knowledge, and everything that my analyst learnt about me will become publicly available, with everyone knowing that it's me that they're talking about. I would not go into analysis. In fact, I think it's impossible to go into analysis and obey the fundamental rule, knowing that if your analyst one day becomes famous enough, then your confidentiality is lost. So, as I say, you might think it's going too far, but I thought it was important. I'll end with this, some new illustrations. As much as you can see, I'm not a critic of the old standard edition. I do think its illustrations were rather poor. So here, I'll just give you two examples of some new ones, just for fun. Here is a letter that Freud wrote to his fiancée, Martha, and he was busy ranting at her in a jealous rage. And while he did so, his ink made these two splotches. And so Freud then made a circle around the splotches, and he explained here, I think this actually means something. It has something to do with my jealousy. In other words, it was his first analysis of a parapraxis. And this last one, this is a letter that Freud sent to Fliess, As you know, Freud sent many, many, many letters to Fliess, very important correspondence. And I just thought it was nice to be able to illustrate, to give a picture of one of these letters, because it's so funny. If you look at the address, it basically just says, to Dr. Fliess in Berlin. How on earth it gets to him, one wonders. So that's it. Oh, no, it's not it. There's entirely new indexes. And this is it. This is the dedication. Here's Strachey's dedication. He said he dedicated the standard edition in volume 1 to the thoughts and words of Sigmund Freud. Their blurred reflection is dedicated by its contriver. And so I will end with my own dedication, which goes like this. And to the noble contrivances of James Strachey, this still imperfect reflection is dedicated by his successor. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I will now ask some questions. The first one has to do with important figures since the decision to produce a revised standard edition was adopted and the moment it came to fruition. Please tell us about the role played by Albert Dixon, about how you were entrusted with the editorial responsibility for the revised standard edition, about Ricardo Steiner, his research and contribution, and about Ilse Grubrich-Simitis, editor responsible for Freud's work at S. Fischer Verlag, who maintained a close relationship with Strachey and with Ernest and Anna Freud. Why is she, in your words, James Strachey's true successor, and not only in Germany? Strachey's team of translators included Anna Freud, Alex Strachey, and Alan Tyson. Please tell us about the team that supported you at the Institute of Psychoanalysis.
Thanks, Carmen. Well, I'm glad, first of all, to have opportunity to say something about Albert Dixon. I was not the first editor of the Revised Standard Edition. He was. In 1989, the Institute decided they're going to revise the Standard Edition, and they appointed Albert Dixon. I think that it's important to, with no disrespect to Albert Dixon, to point out he was not a Freud scholar. He was a copy editor. And that shows how the Institute was imagining the revision initially. In fact, my only role was the untranslated new material. I had, in fact, already come across some of it just in my own scholarly research. But they asked me to include my translations of that newly discovered material, and also some other newly discovered material not discovered by me. They asked me to translate it into English. That was my job. It was as the Institute, which appointed a committee to oversee the work of Dixon, as they realized what was really required. So it became a much deeper revision than they originally had in mind. What they had in mind was we wouldn't even change the pagination. The new material would just be added at the back of each volume so as not to disturb the pagination. And Dixon was just to include Strachey's addenda and corrigenda. And then the idea was, well, maybe we should have a glossary discussing the translation of the technical terms. And then, Albert was out of his depth. And so, and in fact, he was also getting increasingly unwell. So they replaced him with me. That was in 1995, 29 years ago. And Albert died 2 years later. So I took over from him. That was the important part of that is that it was realizing that we need a much deeper revision. And that was why when I had an open mind as to whether we should start from scratch, when I looked through the critical literature in order to see how deep a revision should we actually make. You mentioned Ricardo Steiner. He had, as some people must know, he had already done an enormous amount of research into the history of the translation of Freud into English, and into the history of the standard edition in particular. So when I drew up this glossary of discussion of the technical terms, as I said, I wanted the reader to know how others have translated it prior to Strachey. By the way, not many people, I think it's a little unfair to blame Strachey for all of these technical terms. There was a committee called the Glossary Committee, which was chaired by Jones, and they decided as a committee what the appropriate English word would be for Freud's technical terminology in German. And many of these choices had been made long before Strachey became Freud's translator. In fact, some of them were when Strachey was a schoolboy. So Ricardo Steiner had already plowed through all of this. So I drew upon all of that in my writing up of the discussions of the technical terms. And then Ricardo also helped me. He kept on coming up with new stuff and sending me stuff that I could use in those glossaries. Ilse Grubisch-Semitis is the Freud scholar par excellence in the world. That's why I say she's Strachey's true successor, not only in Germany. She did an enormous amount of research, and for my purposes, the most important part of it was she went to the Library of Congress and went through all Freud's original manuscripts, or those that still survive, and compared the handwritten manuscripts to the earlier draft versions, and compared the handwritten manuscripts to the published German versions. So all of that information she put at my disposal. And whenever I had any doubts about how I should go about certain policy decisions, I drew upon her more than anybody else to guide me and to assist me and to share the enormous responsibility for some of these decisions. Like, for example, should I name Freud's patients? She very strongly agreed with me that I should not. Sadly, well, let me say happily, first of all, she provided a living link between me and Strachey, because she had worked both with Strachey and with me. So that's the bridge that she embodied. Sadly, however, she died earlier this year, but she did see held in her own hands the revised standard edition before she died, and she was very pleased with it, I have to tell you, and with the way it looks and feels. I need to mention there were others that people wrote to me, Freud scholars and students of Freud all over the place kept writing to me. One in particular was Kurt Eisler. He criticized in a very constructive way Strachey's translations. He wrote to Strachey while Strachey was doing the standard edition, and he did the same with me until his death. While I was doing the revised standard edition. Then also the editors of the French edition of Freud's works, the editors of the Dutch edition, they were also very helpful to me, sharing their experience with doing the same job as I was doing into the English, that they were doing into the French and Dutch.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask you another question. Please enlighten us in connection with the remarks you have added in the revised standard edition on neuroscientific aspects of the project for a scientific psychology and interpretation of dreams.
Yes, generally, Strachey, let me put it this way. I had to inhibit myself from imposing my own interpretation of Freud onto the standard edition. And of course, this would be a neuropsychoanalytic interpretation, just as Strachey had to inhibit himself from doing that. Strachey was very Kleinian. And if you read the editorial apparatus of the standard edition, it's not a Kleinian interpretation of Freud at all. And I thought I should do likewise. You don't want a spin. But when it came to the project for a scientific psychology, there we have the problem I've referred to twice already, namely that Strachey was not a scientist. And so there were things that Strachey didn't understand. He mistranslated some things in the project for a scientific psychology because he didn't understand the neuroscientific concepts adequately. So obviously there I've had to make more changes than anywhere else and more editorial comments than anywhere else to new ones, to explain to readers. When it comes to the interpretation of dreams, my own research was on brain mechanism. My own early research was on brain mechanisms of dreaming. And why that's important is because shortly after actually during the publication of the standard edition, there was a revolution in the scientific understanding of dreams with the discovery of REM sleep and the massive critiques that followed of Freudian dream theory, and then subsequently during my own career, a correction of those criticisms of Freudian dream theory as we understood more about the dreaming brain. And in fact, now what we understand about the dreaming brain is remarkably consistent with Freudian theory. And it was Ilse who said to me, I must not inhibit myself here. She said, really here, the reader needs to know the historical fate of Freud's ideas in dream science. And so there I did again more than I did elsewhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And one last question before we go on with the audience. Would you like to share with us memories from the days when you were raised German speaking in Namibia under South African administration, to the high school days in Pretoria, the time at the University of Witwatersrand, and training in London at the Institute of Psychoanalysis?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so you, as you say, I was born in a very obscure part of the world, Namibia, although those days it wasn't called Namibia, it was under South African occupation. It was an old German colony. I was born in a town called Luderitz, and the majority of the population was German. And the interesting thing is that because they were a colony, disconnected from mainland Germany, they still spoke 19th century German. So the German that I learned as a child was 19th century German, in other words, the German of Freud's era. You then mentioned my school, or was it my university? My university you mentioned, University of the Witwatersrand. I'll just say one thing about that. That's where I trained in the branch of neuroscience that was my main profession before I subsequently trained in psychoanalysis. So I was already in the last years of before I left South Africa, I was already interested in Freud's neuroscientific work. And so I was doing a few translations of those early papers for my own use. And I remember one particular occasion sitting in the library in front of the window, translating these obscure 19th century German texts and looking out the window and seeing the police attacking the students were protesting and the police were and I thought, what, this is mad. Here I am sitting doing this, while there's a veritable war going on, out there. And it's that war that ultimately made me leave South Africa, because white boys like me were conscripted. We were obliged to go into the South African army. And I couldn't bring myself to do that. And that's why I went to England, which brought me the great opportunity of training in psychoanalysis. Thanks, Carmen.
Okay. Now I'm going to turn to the public. There's one question. When taking on the Herculean task of revising the standard edition, can you mention any parts of the standard edition that have been especially challenging, even difficult? Are there any Gordian knots left untied for future generations to grapple with?
Oh, yes, there are. I think it's implicit in the editorial policy that I followed that, in other words, where rather than trying to correct Strachey, that the Strachey's translation was controversial, now we'll have the correct version. It's a nonsense. It's impossible. Any new translation will be controversial in new ways. Rather than enact the fantasy, that I could make a perfect translation, rather I accept that translation is imperfect. And this is why the policy I followed is to inform the reader of the uncertainties and the doubts, rather than pretend that we can unravel all of those knots. So this applies not only to individual technical terms. As I said, it applies also to whole titles of papers, turns of phrases upon which much hangs, where it's not clear. It could be translated like this, it could be translated like that. And all that I've tried to do is to make the reader aware of that. Where I think I have unraveled, well, not quite Gordian knots, but unraveled knotty things that could be unraveled, are in relation to, as I've already said, things like misreading of aspects of the project by a non-scientist, and not only in terms of how it's translated, but also in terms of how it's understood. So I've added many footnotes there, and also in terms of translation of terms, like drive, mistranslating it as instinct. I think that really does lead to misunderstanding, to where Freud uses two different words which have two different meanings. The English reader sees only one. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know, which time is Freud speaking about Trieb and which time is Freud speaking about instinct. And likewise, as I said about Nachträglichkeit, the reader doesn't know that Freud's using this concept in many, many interesting places and ways, because the English doesn't identify it as such. So I think I have clarified, I like to believe I have clarified, but certainly imperfectly. And there's certainly many unanswered questions that inevitably have remained.
Mm-hmm. There's a second question. Do you think that Strachey's unresolved negative transference towards Freud had any influence on his translation? That is, transforming Freud's down-to-earth and celebrating literary style into neologisms such as cathexis?
So first of all, Freud celebrated literary style, and it's deservedly celebrated. Freud was a wonderful writer. This is another one of the reasons why I was loath to start afresh. I am not as masterly in the English language as Strachey was. I think Strachey's English is beautiful. It's a little bit outdated in places, and there I've modernized it. But for the most part, I think few people would disagree that Freud's beautiful German literary style is equaled. It's not the same style because it can't be. It's not German, but it is equally literate, equally literary, equally aesthetically appealing, in my view, Strachey's translation. And where I translated this, the material from scratch, the new material, I tried to emulate Strachey's style to the best of my ability. But the question of technical terms, which you foreground, I've already addressed that. I think it is simply consistent with good English that when you're translating German science into English science, you do not use vernacular terms. You do not use ordinary descriptive terms. You use the international language. And remember, dear colleague who's asking this question, I want to make clear, Freud directly supervised Strachey. Freud Strachey, you mentioned Strachey's transference to Freud, so it's actually rather alarming. Strachey was analyzed by Freud 5 times a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Then on Sunday, he would go and visit Freud to discuss the translations. So his analyst, and not only his analyst, Strachey's wife, Alex, was also analyzed by Freud. So the two of them, both patients, married couple, would go to Freud's house on Sundays. So that's a whole other story. But the fact of the matter remains that Freud was there in person, weekly, supervising their translations. After they went back to London, they continued an ongoing correspondence with Freud. As Freud got more unwell, that correspondence was mediated by Anna Freud, who would discuss the matters with her father, then report back to the Strachey's. So these decisions, not only, as I've said already, were they supervised by the glossary committee, the chair of which was Jones, who had to take account of how others had already translated these terms. These things I'm just repeating, so I won't go on with that. But also taking account of Freud's direct approval of these terms. There were, for example, there was a place where Strachey actually asked Freud, should I discuss the fact that I have changed Anlernung from its transparent meaning with the use of anaclysis? Should I put a footnote here? Freud said no footnote is necessary. So, there you have it. As regards negative transference, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Certainly, Alex Strachey complained that Freud, in fact, she eventually left Freud and went to Abram instead. She wasn't too impressed with Freud's powers as an analyst. I'm not aware of James Strachey. If there was a negative transference, there may well have been, but I can't pinpoint it or any evidence about. But what I can say is that I told you Strachey had visual problems. But in fact, ironically, over these last few years, as I finished the Revised Standard Edition, I too have got serious visual problems. It seems to be an occupational hazard. But Strachey had visual problems much worse than mine, and he misread things. And of course, as a psychoanalyst, you can't help noticing that he misreads some things and not other things. The unconscious influences these things. And I think it would be a very interesting study for somebody to, because I've underlined everything I've changed, everything that Strachey left out. I put a little footnote and said Strachey left this sentence out and so on. It would be a very interesting study if somebody wants to undertake it, not me, to do an analysis of why did Strachey misread that and why did Strachey omit that unconsciously? Because I can assure you there's some very interesting patterns there, not of a negative transference to Freud, but in my opinion of another kind. Let's just say that.
Okay. There's another question in relation to footnotes. It says, can you share if footnotes were added with references to the works of scholars, scientists, psychologists, and psychoanalysts from the 20th and 21st centuries that are relevant to Freud's original writings?
No, that would be, I think that would be a different piece of work. What I have done is I have updated the footnotes in relation to Freud's scholarship. So any developments in Freud's scholarship, in other words, in understanding who this patient, where they lived, who they're talking about, undoing the disguise, that sort of thing, correcting errors in terms of, for example, Groote-Semitis's discovery. Freud said that beyond the pleasure principle and the hypothesis of the death drive can't have been in response to the death of his daughter, because he wrote it before the death of his daughter. Well, it turns out that that crucial chapter in which the concept of the death drive is introduced, that part was written after the death of his daughter. And so this is what I mean by advances in Freud's scholarship. That, I think, is the editor's job, is to update the historical context within which these works were produced. It's an entirely different job to start saying, now, how do we understand these things today in psychoanalysis? That would be, I mean, the commentary would be 100 times bigger than the translations, because there's all manner of different schools of psychoanalysis that have developed Freud's ideas in all manner of different ways. Gosh, that is an enormous undertaking. But not only is it an enormous undertaking beyond the scope of what I want to do, I really I think I've done enough in terms of this sort of thing. But and I do try to update Freud in my own scientific work, in my own way, in relation to my own tradition. But that's not the job of the editor of Freud's complete works. I think that's the job of all of us, trying to continue to develop our discipline and to develop it in ways that are cognizant of where we come from and cognizant of what other people are doing in other approaches to psychoanalysis. That's not the job, I think, of the editor of Freud's writings.
Mm-hmm. There's one question, in maybe perhaps in relation to what you're saying. 29 years is an enormous amount of time. Once you have decided on your approach, did you stay with it throughout, or did you find that because of advances in various disciplines, maybe including translation methods, you change or revise your way of doing things, or did you stay with your original plan through all that nearly 3 decades?
Well, in the beginning, when I was appointed, I didn't have a plan. I spent, when I say I went through the secondary literature, you have to understand that's not a small literature. The literature discussing Freud translation and the issues in the general literature about translation, about which it's a whole specialist literature of its own. I needed to immerse myself in all of that literature. Actually, I'm sitting in my study here now, and to my left over there, I had 4 crates full of that literature. So it's in the beginning, I tried to form an opinion, and obviously not only by reading that literature, but by then going to the Freud in the German and going to Strachey in the English and seeing, okay, what is happening here in relation to what these commentators were saying. On the basis of that, I formulated a policy. That policy I then discussed with respected colleagues. Most of all, I discussed these policies with Ilse Grubisch-Semitis, but I also discussed them with Eisler and with Ricardo Steiner and with Patrick Mahoney. He was also very helpful in the early years in terms of us. And I had a committee, the Revised Standard Edition Committee, which was a subcommittee of the Publications Committee of the British Psychoanalytical Society. And I didn't consult them. In the beginning, they told me what to do in some respects. I have to say, although it sounds disrespectful, I don't mean it disrespectfully. They all eventually died, except for Ricardo. So that committee that was my superego, they gradually disappeared. And so then I had more free rein. So I'm talking about the formulation of the policies and obeying what I was instructed to do and arguing where necessary. And taking advice from scholars. That happened over the first, I would say, 5 years or so. But then once I'd formulated a policy, then it was over the next 20 odd years, and I say 20 odd, I know it doesn't add up to 29, I'll tell you why. Over the next 20 odd years, I then just plowed through all the work implementing those policies. Obviously, when you implement any policy, you adjust it, but there were minor adjustments along the way. The last few years, once I started submitting my work to the Institute and to Rowman and Littlefield, the Institute got readers to read each, anonymous readers, I mean, colleagues, reviewers in essence, to read through the work I had submitted and ask them to offer their critical opinions on what I had done. Out of that process came some suggestions some of which certainly warranted me having a second go at some things. So I then, and that included some policy decisions. For example, the underlining of everything that I changed in Strachey. That was a suggestion from the review process. It wasn't an idea of my own. So I hope I've answered that question adequately. Thank you.
Would you like to give some close words, no, to finish? I'm going to
well, I will just close like this. When I took on this task, like many things in life, I didn't fully know what I was taking on. You know, you have to do it to realize what you've committed yourself to. But I certainly don't regret it, having done it. I'll tell you the greatest reward for doing it is that if you do what I did, comparing sentence by sentence, what was the idea that he was trying to convey in these German words, so that you can be sure that you're conveying the same idea in English words. It certainly acquaints you more closely than any other method might do with Freud's thinking. I have to say, and I say it with a due immodesty, I think I understand Freud better than anyone now, and that's been the reward of what I've done. But I also, in doing this, knowing how controversial the matter of Freud is, let alone Freud translation, I was bracing myself for a mixed response. I knew, no good deed goes unpunished, Mark. Brace yourself, there's going to be a storm of protest no matter what you do. And so, I was ready for it. I have to say now, where are we? 5 months since it first saw the light of day, the Revised Standard Edition. So far, the reception has been much warmer than I anticipated, and for that I'm grateful, but it's only been 5 months. Let's see what comes next. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carmen, for your looking after this process and for your interesting questions and for your hosting the questions from the audience. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, again, and thank all the participants in the webinar. I am grateful to have been invited to moderate the webinar by Sylvia Weinhood, who chairs the IPA Communications Committee, and by Mariano Rupertas, coordinator of webinars. It has been both an honor and a pleasure to be here today. What, one might ask, does it take for a psychoanalyst, a neuroscientist, to become a scholarly editor? Extraordinary talent to take up the titanic effort on the one hand and unwavering dedication on the other. We thank Dr. Solms for this monumental achievement, and so will the coming generations of serious students, analysts, and scholars. Let us remember his predecessor's principle, that is, to render into English Freud, only Freud, and nothing but Freud, as we celebrate Dr. Mark Solms' outstanding accomplishment. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to read the next webinar. The next webinar is the IPA Journal Club with Dorothy Evans Holmes, and that's going to be in December the 13th at 4 o'clock London time. And panelists will be Dorothy Evans Holmes and moderator Jack Drescher. Okay, thank you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you all. Thanks for coming.